Hello and welcome to Responsible Government Contracting. This workshop is part one of a three-part series introducing government contracting. Today, Mr. Andy Bennett will discuss steps necessary to register to do business with the government. Thank you, and find us on the web at nc-rgc.com.
Welcome, and again, my name is Andy Bennett. So we're going to have these recordings up on my website once you get it. So it'll be free up there just for anybody to take a look at, and then previous sessions so you can kind of compare. We do this once a month, and it's a three-part cycle every single month. So like Patricia said, sometimes we'll get some information or different participation in different events. So ask questions if I speak too quickly, pause. I've got my chat open, so please shoot a chat or just speak up if you feel comfortable doing that. And like I said, each month is a little bit different because this is such a broad topic. So your questions, this is a workshop, not a lecture. So your questions will help guide me what the interest of the audience is, so we can kind of tailor it that way. So today is part one of a three-part. Right. And this, we're talking about federal. I'm going to focus on federal contracting, but that application can go to the state and local municipalities, cities, counties, local townships. That application can also go to grants. Right. So this acquisition thing is kind of a very broad topic. I'm going to try and boil it down to make it as practical. And I'm going to talk to you guys like your business owners. Many of you are, so that you can know what it is that you need to do. This is like explaining taxes to somebody for the first time. You're not going to get it the first time. Don't feel bad if you don't get it the first time. It's okay. It's a very complicated process. So we're going to boil it down and make it as user-friendly as possible. So like I said, I've been doing this for about 21 years. So we're going to break this down into the first step is register. Next step is going to be research. And then the third part is going to be respond. So we're going to look at how to register and structure and set up your business, kind of what the who's who, I've got my hats out. That'll make sense in a second here. In the next part, we're going to talk about research. How do you actually find these opportunities? Now that you're prepared, what we're doing today, how do you find those opportunities? What is your benefit as a small business? How to talk to the contracting officers and talk to the end users. And then part three, we're going to go into how to actually put the response together, whether that's an RFQ, RFP, response, request for quote, request for proposal. What does that response look like? How do you need to formulate the documents that you actually need to send? What does that flavor look like? So how to actually do it. So again, we're taking a practical approach here. Again, ask questions. I'm going to ask for a guinea pig. If anybody wants me to use their company as kind of my test case, because I'll pull up actual live websites here and we'll look for opportunities that might make sense for you guys. So off to the races here. First up is register. So what are we talking about and why do we care? Because I kind of like to poll the audience in the first, if you want to throw in the chat, what are the words that come to mind when you start thinking about federal government and federal acquisitions and contracting and all that kind of stuff? A lot of responses that I get are red tape or cumbersome or complicated or a waste of time because it's so big, or, scared to approach, or you've got to have a friend or an aunt or an uncle doing it so that you kind of have a who's who. I respect all of that, right? So it is all of those things depending on how you come to the table. So I appreciate and I respect all of those approaches. We're going to try and demystify that and kind of set those conceptions aside. To kind of put parameters around what we're talking about are these graphics up on the screen now. The top part is what we all learned about in school. So this is Civics 101. What is our federal government? Right. So we have three parts to the government, just as a refresher for those of us that it might have been a minute. The legislative branch, that's Congress. The executive branch, that's the president. And then the judicial branch, that's, the Supreme Court and those guys. So when we start looking at how does federal contracting apply in those three worlds, the first part, they set those are our congressmen and women. Those are the legislature. They are the ones that get lobbied throughout the year. They're setting the priorities of the budget, what's important to their constituents, a lot of lobbying, and that happens throughout the year. During this time, like where we are right now, May, June, July, that's when they start to formulate a budget. And if you pay attention to the news, kind of listen, this debt ceiling debate, and when we start talking about the budget, it will usually happen, and agnostic, separate from party, this is not political, this is just process. Typically that conversation will switch to the budget around June, July, August, because the federal budget is on a September cycle. So October to September is the federal budget cycle. So Congress is doing that politicking now to prepare for that budget in a few months. Once Congress, we all have heard the kind of phrase control with the purse strings. That's what that means. So in practical sense, when Congress writes the budget, they are saying, okay, President, you have the authority to spend $10 billion on this program. If you buy pencils or pens, that's up to you. That's in the details, but you can buy this many battleships and this many aircraft carriers, right? So that's the level that Congress is getting at, right? So they control that. They control those purse strings at that level with the federal budget. Move over to the exec. Now we're done with Congress, right? So Congress signs the bill, or Congress writes the bill, President signs it. Congress's role is done. They work on next year's budget. Now it's up to the middle part there in blue, the executive branch. That's why it's called the executive branch, because they execute, right? So the executive branch, starting with the president at the top, and then just like a pyramid chain of command, the president's, worker bees is that cabinet. So you hear Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, you hear Department of Education, Department of Interior, Department of Homeland Security, all those guys in the middle. When the president sets the agenda, each of those worlds, defense, education, Homeland Security, energy, each of those worlds is looking at the agenda from their perspective. Okay, this is what the boss wants to do. Here's how I can help execute it. And then on down that food chain, and we'll start talking about that here in a second, on down that food chain is where the programs and project managers and the actual, if you want to say boots on the ground, that's where the actual work gets done. So table that we're going to talk in more detail there for a second. And then we'll set the Supreme Court aside because we don't want to touch that, right? So that's why we're talking about this. This world is ruled by, the rule book here is called the Federal Acquisition Regulation. I'm going to refer to that as the FAR. It's big, it's long, it's cumbersome. Don't be scared off by that. Ask questions, right? So let me pause here and see if there's anything on the top half of the screen that doesn't make sense. Okay, the bottom half of the screen is the budget. And this is where we're talking about the huge, $6-7 trillion budget. This screenshot is from last year's fiscal year. And this is how our taxpayer dollars were spent. So you can see in orange and red here, those are, what people might refer to as entitlements. Okay, so Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those types of things, payroll, those types of things, that's 2/3 of the budget set aside. And again, that's the big number, right? So the $6-7 trillion, 2/3 of that, set that aside. The rest of it is still a massive amount of funding, but that's really where we start to talk about that executive spending project, the actual dollars that we're talking about in the contracting world, okay? So just to kind of frame out what we're talking about hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars that are available to be contracted. Why does that matter? We're still talking big picture. Andy, make it make sense to me. Why do I care about this? Okay, so that big number, 23.7% of that number by law must be spent every single year with small businesses. Let me say that again. 23.7% of that number, of that big number, must be awarded to small businesses, okay? Even more specific than that, 5% must be awarded to minority-owned companies. A separate 5% must be awarded to woman-owned companies. A separate 3% must be awarded to veteran-owned companies. And then the final category is what's called hub zone, or historically underutilized business zone, hub. That's economically depressed areas. So those small business categories are crucially important in federal government. It's law, it's a Small Business Act. It's not a new thing. This has been for decades and decades. So our government mandates that percentages of that budget be spent with small businesses. If you're a small business owner, you need to be thinking along those lines, because the impact of that, and I'll fast forward a little bit, the impact of that is up to $4.5 million within 2 weeks, which is lightning speed in federal contracting. $4.5 million per contract action can be set aside for and sole sourced to those different categories if you have the small business certifications, right? So those are hugely powerful, hugely powerful. If you qualify for any or all of those, I recommend, seriously considering that. Okay, so now let's again boil down to who the people are we're talking about. When I talked about the president on top, and then the cabinet level, and then all the way down. Whether you're talking about a military person and structure, or you're talking about Department of Energy or education, whatever it is, if you kind of boil away, the job titles, these are the 4 categories that I've found repeat themselves. All right. So we're going to go with, first up here is finance. So the finance guys, and kind of make it easy for you to remember, green, money, cash. Party City didn't have the little visor thing, so I'm going with the cowboy hat here. So the finance guys, you're not going to deal with them when you're bidding on contracts, okay? They are not advising or in the room selecting who wins the contract. These are the guys that you're going to deal with after you've won the contract and you're looking to get your invoices paid. 9 times out of 10, when I talk to a business owner and they're reticent of doing business with the federal government, one of the reasons that they have is they're slow to pay. The federal government is difficult to get the invoices approved. Okay, that's fair. What I know in my mind is that 9 times out of 10, it's probably the business owner that has messed up the invoicing, the details on the invoice, because with hundreds of thousands of contractors, there's about 600,000 or 700,000 contractors that are registered in with the federal government. They don't have time to be on the phone with every single one, and if the invoice isn't properly formatted, they're going to reject it. Okay, it's rejected. These are the people. Every single contract that I have ever seen in my experience has at least 2 human beings listed with their phone numbers and email addresses on the contract, and it's these finance people. Why? Especially if you're a small business, because these people, they don't get a bonus if they save money, right? They don't get a bonus if they don't pay their bills. That's not how it works. They have to pay. It's actually called the Prompt Payment Act. They have to pay their bills. The government does. So if you are having issues or are unsure, or you haven't done it before, get these people, these finance people, on the phone with you. Call them. That's their job. They will walk you through the process, and they will walk you through how to actually do the invoicing. Okay. I suggest, especially on that first invoice, get the finance people on the phone, make sure that you formatted the invoice properly, make sure you're walking through, the QuickBooks for the government, wide area workflow, or IPP, or whatever the system is that they're using. Walk through it with them and make sure you understand how to invoice properly. Once you get that first invoice approved and processed, typically every single follow-on invoice is gonna flow right through. Okay, so these are the finance people. They help you get the bills paid. Use them effectively. They are there to help you. Okay, next up is the commander. terminology here matters. I'm in Tampa, so we have Gasparilla down here. And if you know anything about Gasparilla, it's a pirate kind of invasion. So have a little fun with this. So the commander is the one in charge. They are, if you're comparing this to the commercial sector, the commander is the CEO or the president or the COO of that organization, of that company. In government speak, that commander, that director, that secretary, that person in charge is going to have different job titles, but they're the one in charge of that local, wherever you are in that chain of command, they're the person that's in charge of that local office. Why is that important? What do they bring to the table? This is different than commercial. This is different than what you're used to. Government is different. The commander has no authority to award contracts. They do not, let me say that again. They do not have the authority to pick winners and losers. Their job is to set the agenda for their office. Okay? So they will listen to what their chain of command tells them, what their headquarters and all the way up to the president. They will listen to what those objectives are. The commander or the boss of that organization will pick what keeps their mission in line with the boss's objective. And then they themselves will set what's called mission type orders or broad directions for their organization. Okay, got it. This is what we're supposed to be working on. These are the things that we're going to work on. Okay, so that's the commander's job. They're going to set that broad direction. In the room, listening to the commander speak are end users, the hard hat. This is going to be your project man. Again, different titles, different job titles for the same thing. Project managers, program managers, end users, mission partners. That's another common one that's called. These are the operational people. These are the people that are out in the field, boots on the ground, however you want to call it. They are the people who are listening to the commander's direction and saying, okay, boss, got it. These are the things you want us to work on. In order to get that done, that broad mission type order done, we need to focus on these specific projects, right? So the project manager, they're going to develop what's called a needs statement. Okay, so that's the first document that actually describes what it is that's getting done. Okay, that's the needs, like I need something, right? A needs statement. That needs statement is going to be crucial. And let me be practical here for a second. Why and how is this end user important to you as a business owner? Because they are the one that is writing that needs statement. If you sell computers, if you sell something that is specific or specification driven, the details matter, right? You're going to have a whole bunch of details or specs on your sales sheet. You're going to know why yours is better than your competition's. You are fully allowed to talk to and educate the end users on why your stuff, whatever it is, product or service, on why your stuff is better than your competition. Inform the end user with your sales sheets, your white papers, your marketing slicks, whatever you want. A capability statement is what they're going to refer to it as. Inform the end user of why and how your stuff is better than theirs. Do you have an ISO 9000 certification? Do you have a 15-inch monitor versus their 14-inch monitor? Is your processing speed faster, better, cheaper, whatever? If you're in janitorial services, maybe you use cleaning products that are different, cleaner, faster, less corrosive than somebody else's. What are those details that make your stuff better than theirs? Why? Because if you do it convincingly, your specification makes it into the needs statement. And now what they're not allowed to do is say, okay, well, they can, but they have to jump through a lot of hoops to do it. They're going to say, I need a monitor that is 15 inches, no less than 15 inches. Well, if you're the only one that's selling a 15-inch monitor and your competition selling a 14-inch monitor, they're not necessarily going to specify, I want a Dell 15-inch monitor. they have to boil out the brand names. So they're going to say, I want a 15-inch monitor. I want non-corrosive cleaning materials. I want an ISO 9000 certified workshop, whatever it is that makes yours better. If that specification makes it into the needs statement, you have just reduced your competition, right? So if they make a 14-inch monitor, they're not going to be able to compete on that bid. Okay. Doesn't guarantee that you win, but it puts you in a better position to submit a winning proposal. All right. So that's the end user. Last up, saving the best for last here. I'm going to give you 1 second to guess who's most important in this process, at least from my opinion. All right. So I've got my blur on, so you can't really see the crown. All right. So the crown, this is the contracting officer. The contracting officer is the only, and this is important to understand. The contracting officer is the only one, the only position in the federal government that is authorized to obligate the federal government. They're the only one that is allowed to sign and commit the federal government. That's hugely important, and understand that. What they are not is the subject matter expert in the thing that's being done, purchased, whatever, right? So they are not the subject matter expert. Their job is to focus on process. They are going to look at things like, okay, is there fair competition? Is the government getting a reasonable price for the product? Are we using our small businesses, right? Because those percentages that I mentioned before, it's up to the contracting officer to make that real. Contract officers get fired if they don't meet their small business objectives. Okay, so that's important to know. So if you're talking, and we'll talk about when you can talk to these people and when you have to stop talking to these people. But when it's appropriate to talk to the contracting officers before the actual RFP is published, you can educate the contracting officer and say, hey, listen, ma'am, sir, we do this. We are a minority certified company. We are a woman-owned certified company. Those are the types of things that you want to educate the contracting officer on, because they see that's what they care about. Not so much the ISO 9000 piece, because that's what the subject matter expert's going to care about. That's what the end user sees. The contracting officer is going to see, okay, past performance. You've done this thing before. You're not risky, right? So you've got partners. You have the small business certifications, right? So those are the types of things that the contracting officer is going to take into account. Said differently, right? This slide just says the same thing that I just said, just a little bit differently here. I'm going to take off my crown here. Okay, so left side to right side, the commander, the boss, is going to set those broad mission type orders, the broad intent. The project managers and users are going to take that broad intent and make it specific. They're going to develop the needs statement. The needs statement is going to go over to the contracting officer, and that's going to be reformatted. Same document, same content is going to be reformatted in what you may be more familiar with, a performance work statement, a statement of work, those types of things, right? So that's going to be formatted. And then the contracting officer is going to be the interface with industry, with us, with companies, right? They're going to go through the competition. They're going to receive all the proposals. They're going to be a wall between industry and the end user. You can't, once that competition starts, you can't talk to the end users anymore. Okay. So I'm going to pause here again and see if you guys have any questions. Okay, let's keep rolling. That's the process. Okay, so now what are we buying? This is by NAICS code, and this is the first time, but I'm going to use that term a lot. It stands for North American Industry Classification System. Depending on what part of the country you're in, people may pronounce it differently. NAICS, NAICS, I call it NAICS code. That's what I'm talking about, all right? When you register your company, if you already have a company, and you got a tax ID number from the IRS, in order to get that TIN or EIN, you had to pick a NAICS code. You had to pick your primary line of business. There are some 1,300 NAICS codes. It's a 6-digit number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6-digit number. And it's going to classify what type of business you're in so that the government can tell soybean farmers, from janitors, from IT companies, right? So that's the classification system. Why is that important? Because that contracting officer who is looking for janitorial companies can now search and filter and look for janitorial companies. They're not going to keyword search janitor. They're going to look for that NAICS code that is for janitorial services. Also, why is that important? We're going to talk about this in part 2. Why is that important? Because that contracting officer that has a requirement, like we just talked about, they have a requirement, they have to pick one NAICS code that best matches that requirement. So process that for a second. If I'm building a building, well, that building is going to have plumbing, it's going to have electrical, it's going to have carpentry, it's going to have paint, it's going to have floors. All of those are separate NAICS codes. So how in the world is a contracting officer going to pick one NAICS code to build a building? Well, it's probably going to roll up to a general contractor NAICS code or a construction NAICS code. So you, as a company, you need to know that and think about this world in those terms. Okay, I'm a plumber. I can search for plumbing NAICS codes, but if I want to be part of that construction job, I need to be partnering with a GC, a general contractor, and looking for that NAICS code. What is it that you do and where does it fit in the puzzle? Okay, so just I'm planting that seed so that we can start talking, thinking about that for part 2 here. All right, so this is a filter of how the federal government bought and where they spent their money from last cycle, again, last fiscal year. It's kind of all over the place, but what this kind of shows is the products and services, those broad categories are the blue and the orange here, right? So that's a third for each of those. Products about a third, services about a third. And then the remaining third is cats and dogs. So that's just, what do we have? Like finance and wholesale trade and healthcare, utilities, all a bunch of different stuff. But products and services, manufacturing and services are the 2 primary NAICS codes that are being used. They're being spent, money being spent on. So how do we look at the timeline? I kind of set this a little bit at the top with Congress and the budget cycle. This is different from a lot of commercial companies. The timeline, the schedule, the calendar for the federal government starts on October 1st every single year. It's been this way for a long, long time. Starts on October 1st. And then it goes through the following September 30th. That is the fiscal, not physical, that is the fiscal or financial year for the government. Okay. So again, when you listen to your news on, over the summertime building up to September, that's why everybody starts stressing out. And if you've been through a government shutdown, that's why midnight on September 30th is important. That's when the federal, no kidding, that's when the money runs out. All right. So again, practical. As a business owner, why is that important to you? Except for COVID, and you can see on the timeline at the top there, it's a very predictable spend cycle. All right. It is and on the left side, I've got 3 different agencies, and I can predict when those peaks and valleys are going to be. Very predictably, the government is going to go through a cycle every June, July, August, leading up into September, where they're going to spend, and it's going to be a exponential growth every September. All right. It happens every year. Why? Andy, we've been doing this for a minute. Why haven't they figured this out? Are they just, incompetent? What is it that's going on in the government? Well, we have a lot of smart, very dedicated people working in the government. Trust me on that. The reason they do this is because it's accountability as a taxpayer. All right. We don't want the government just to have, we have a year, they have 12 months to spend their budget and that's it. And we want accountability from that. The challenge is if you're FEMA, let me use FEMA as an example. If you're FEMA, one of your jobs is to respond to natural disasters, right? So if you're responding to hurricanes, I'm in Florida. So if you're responding to hurricanes, well, I can't really I can't plan my budget because hurricane season is June to November. and that sandwiches the fiscal year. So if we get a hurricane in September and they've already spent the majority of their budget, they're out of money, and they can't, I mean, they don't just go back to Congress for, additional spending. They have to plan their budget accordingly. So instead of just spending a 1/12 of their budget every month, they have to kind of reserve or hold back some funding to plan for those contingencies, right? If a hurricane hits in October, they've just started their year. They've got a bunch of budget, they're fine. But if they don't plan correctly and a hurricane hits in September, which happens all the time, knock on wood, they need to be prepared for that. All right. And they're good about that. And the way they do that is they hold back and they reserve some funding. Apply that across the board to every single federal agency. And what you have is contracting officers with a bunch of reserved funding going into September. And then they know that they have to spend all that funding by the end of September. So it's a crazy season, right? So practically, what does this matter for you? Introduce yourselves and make sure you foster those relationships with the contracting officers throughout the year. Don't be surprised if a contracting officer does not answer your phone call, the first phone call on September 29th. They're busy, right? So leave them alone. But introduce yourselves throughout the year and make sure they know who you are, and make sure they know your small business certifications. Because what will happen, I can almost promise you this, what will happen is the contracting officers will give you a call on September 1st, September 15th and say, hey, Andy, I know you've got your 8A certification. I know you're doing janitorial services. Can you take $500,000 and do that type of service for me if I write you a contract right now? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Got it. On it. What you don't have to do is spend that money, because writing the contract means you've got the award, and then you can execute, you can spend those funds over the next 12 months or, however long the contract's for. So the contracting officers have to write that contract by the end of the fiscal year. That's a very important concept. So let me pause for questions there. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, let's keep rolling. This next one is just going to show you kind of how those small business categories, so that on the bottom right there represents the 23% of the budget, right? And small businesses are so important that there are only 2 categories of business in the federal government, right? Small business, obviously we've talked about that. And then it's not large business, it's other than small, right? So it's small business and other than small business. And that's the classification. We will talk about next class, we will talk about how to determine if you're a small business, but just kind of as a read ahead, it's defined by Small Business Administration. It's not 50 employees, it's not 100 employees. It varies by NAICS code. Within, again, on the left side here, within those categories, you can see the 5% for minority, 5%, and 3% and 3%. Okay, so with the small business categories in mind, this is what the actual dollars are, and this is the impact of that small business classification. In one fiscal year, last fiscal year, the federal government spent, I'll do the math for you here, so that's 148 billion in the small business category, the total small business category. Minority owned was 19 billion, woman owned was almost 25 billion, hub zone was almost 14 billion, and veteran owned was just over 30 billion. So you can see, and let me kind of break that down for you also. If you're a minority owned company, you can fully compete in the open category. And you may win some of that open category. Not all of your work has to be set aside as a minority small business. So keep that in mind, that minority, this only represents the contracts that were specifically set aside for minority owned companies, or woman owned, or veteran owned, or hub zone. right? So those companies are winning full and open work also. So just keep that in mind as well. So those numbers of potential work, it's the full contract value, not just these set aside categories. Now let's look at how, and I've had contract officers join this call before, and they kind of laugh at this, but they say, Andy, this nails it. So I'm going to look at 3 different agencies, and we're going to talk about how they spent their budget last year. So agency A, this first guy over here, he requested $100 for his budget, but he only spent $80 of that budget. Come September 30th, he only spent $80. Agency B, the next guy's up, they asked for $100, they spent $100. Okay, great. And C asked for 100, spent more. Okay, got it. Now, how does the federal government, how does Congress respond to this next year? Why is this guy getting fired? Well, because his commander, his or her commander, is going to ask for the same budget, or maybe a little bit more, that they asked for last year. But Congress is, the appropriators are going to look at that spend from the previous year and say, you asked for 100, you didn't spend the whole thing. Why the heck am I going to give you the same amount? I'm going to give you what you actually spent last year, and their budget just got reduced by 20%. And in government, money is power. Their budget is how they hire people and how they grow their organization. So they just lost 20% of their budget there. That contracting officer is getting fired. Agency B here, they did exactly what they expected. And they're going to get exactly what they asked for because they've proven that they can do, and they've spent to budget. So they're fine. This is good. The crazy bonkers part here, if you're thinking about this from a commercial sector and transition and looking at the government sector, this is where it gets weird. If you're in the commercial business, this person got fired because they went over budget significantly. If you're in government, and this is broad strokes, right, guys? So this is not every single time, all the time. But if you're in government, that program was so wildly successful that needs to be funded, that plus up needs to be granted for the next year. So if they spent over budget, they probably are going to have justification and possibly will receive that plus up, the additional funding, for the next year. So that's in government, that's considered a good thing. Let me pause there again for questions, because now we're going to start digging into some of the weeds here. Okay. So I'm going to build this slide up to 3. So if you're taking screenshots, wait a second, and then we'll get to, once I show number 3 here, you can take a screenshot. So this website, or if you just want to Google Secretary of State for Florida, or Secretary of State for Texas or California, wherever you are primarily operating your business is where you need to go to start your business. Okay, so now we're specifically talking about how to register for government work. The first couple of steps are going to be the same whether you're doing commercial or government work. If you're just starting a business, you need to do these first couple of steps. Talk to an attorney. There are several that do workshops through this same platform, so please take advantage of that. I am not an attorney, but you need to consider if you're an LLC, a corporation, a sole proprietorship, partnership, those types of things, right? So you need to decide that going into it and answer those questions here. When you go to the Secretary of State's website for your state, you register, you pay the fee. This is the only step, pay attention here. This is the only step in the entire process that you have to pay for, okay? There are going to be a lot of companies that you'll get emails from that are sounding very convincing. You don't have to pay for their services. This is the only step that you have to pay for, and it's a state requirement. I think in Florida, it's $125. It varies state to state, but just know that's the only registration. That's the only thing that you actually have to pay for. The next thing up is the IRS. Louisiana switches this where you have to register with the IRS first and not the state. But most other states that I found, you do the state first and then you go to the IRS, get your tax ID number or your employer identification number, I've not heard anything that, those are interchangeable, right? So TIN or EIN. So get that number from the IRS. And again, you'll have to register, you'll have to pick a NAICS code there. This third one is actually no more. You can go to that site. Here, I'll take that off so you can see it. You can go to that site if you want to get a DUNS number, a Dun and Bradstreet number for free, but the federal government does not require that anymore. That's a recent change, so you don't have to do that anymore. But you can get a DUNS number for free if you're intending to do work with the government. Okay. Tip and trick here, I'll save you 2 months of frustration. Make sure that you have a physical address. The government does not like post office boxes. So a PO box is not going to fly in the next couple of steps. A lot of the shared office space places are giving suite numbers now. That's acceptable, right? So just make sure you have a suite number, not a post office box. Another thing, make sure you're absolutely consistent with the naming of your company and the naming of your address. So if you are Acme LLC and you capitalize every single letter, then make sure on all of these steps that you're registering the capitalized every single letter, comma LLC, or whatever it is, make sure it's consistent for all these sites. Address. If you're doing 123 Main Street for the Secretary of State, but then you do 123 Main ST for the IRS, that may cause you problems. So just make sure you're absolutely consistent with the way you type in the addresses, the name, all these details, because in the next steps, these databases are going to start to talk to each other. And if they don't match, then you're going to have an issue. I actually was working with a company yesterday, and she had just started, she had just signed the lease for her, shared use space. And when she went to sam.gov, which will be here in a second, when she went to sam.gov, it didn't acknowledge, it didn't see her address. So that didn't match yet. So she's got to, wait for that to match. Real human beings, real people from the government are going to review this and look at it to make sure everything matches. If they have questions, they'll email you, but we'll get to that in a second. All right, so the next up is this secure.login.gov. You're going to use this. This doesn't cost anything. You're going to use this a bunch. And the way it works is you can have it call you automatically. You can have an authenticator app. Think of this as like logging into your bank account. There's multi-factor or two-factor authentication now. What I picked is, it has a Google authenticator. So every 60 seconds, it recycles and gives me a new 6-digit code. I put in my email address, my password, and then that 6-digit code, and I'm in, right? So that you can pick what type of authentication you want, but sign up for that because you need that in order to go to sam.gov. Now be careful here, because there are a bunch of companies that are very, very convincing with their websites that look very, very similar to the real one. Make sure you are on that website. Make sure you are on SAM, like Uncle Sam, sam.gov, G-O-V. If it's a .com or .something else, you're not on the right website. So go to sam.gov, and it should look like that. Then you're going to go in, and I'll actually show you here in a second. So as we go into that website, and I'm sharing it now. So I'm going to do my sign in here. I've already done the login.gov thing. So you can see it's taking me to that secure.login.gov. My email address and my password. Where'd my phone go? And then I'm going to have to do the authenticator, which is that 6-digit code. So let me pull it up here. Changes every 60 seconds. So I'm going to type in my 6-digit code, and then I'm good. So now I will be in. It's going to take me automatically to my dashboard. I'm going to go back to home, up here in home, and then I'm just going to get started. So I'm up on the home screen, green on the right. I'm going to click get started. And from here, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. I'm going to go through this. Give yourself a couple of hours, because there's a lot of questions. You're going to have, you're going to Google a lot of terms. But basically what they're doing is making sure you're not foreign owned or operated. You're a US based company. You have an email address. You have a physical address. You've already done your tax ID number. They're going to give you an MPIN. That's M as in Mike, PIN. That's kind of your password for this. So make sure you write that down. And a bank account. Make sure you have a bank account before this, because they're going to ask for your routing number and account number for your bank account. So they're trying to get all this stuff, all this payment stuff out of the way so that you're set up for success as you win the contracts. So that's sam.gov. We're going to go back to sam.gov in part 2 for the actual searching. So remember that. And then you're going to start to get emails. You're going to probably get an automatic email saying, yep, we got your registration, you're good to go. And then if there's questions, they will send you emails. So make sure you're checking your spam folder and your junk folder and all that kind of stuff. Because if you do not respond within 3 to 5 business days, they're going to reject your application and you're not going to get a cage code. And then you've got to start the whole process over again. So that cage code, it's commercial and government entity, right? CAG, cage code. They just came up with cage. So that cage code is going to be that's your like social security number for doing government business. Bad example, because you don't want to put your social security number on a resume. But with the cage code, you want that on everything that goes to these government contracting people, because that's the thing. It's a 5-digit numbers and letters, alphanumeric. It's a 5-digit alphanumeric that's your special number, right? So that number is unique to your company. There's another one. It's called the Unique Entity ID, a UEI. That's a relatively new thing. So you will see some, it's like teaching an old dog new tricks. You will see some contracting officers that still ask for a DUNS number. You will see some contracting officers that only ask for the UEI or the cage code. So just be aware that that's a thing. You will likely get your UEI, the Unique Entity ID, immediately. And then you will be able to get that cage code. That usually takes 10 to 15 days. So once you get that cage code, make sure you plaster that all over your capability statements, your resume, your marketing information, all that type of stuff, right? So make sure you've got that information there. All right, so I'm going to sneak in one more thing here since we've got a second. We're going to talk about, I'm going to poll the audience here. So what do you guys, I'm going to circle back to the small business question. What do you guys think is classified a small business? What makes what is the definition of a small business?
Under 500 people in some industries.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I think it's under a certain dollar value too. Like I think I was looking in the manufacturing industry, and I think it's like under 7 million.
Good. Chris is on the right track. So there is not a single definition for what is a small business. And this is with government, right? So with the federal government, they actually update it every couple of years. And it's a table. And go back to NAICS codes. Remember the North American Industry Classification System. I'm going to put this Google term in the chat so you guys can search for it, because the website changes every so often. Everyone in the meeting. All right, so what I just put in the chat is what I Googled for. And then what I'm looking for is this table size standard. And it's just a PDF document. This is what it looks like. So if you want to screenshot this, I'll put this in the chat if that's helpful. But again, this changes periodically. So if I look at this, let me zoom in a little bit. These are all the NAICS codes. Okay. So you can see the definition of a soybean farmer, like a small business that does soybean farming, is $2.25 million. So if you're running average year to year for the last 5 years is $2.25 million or more, you're not a small business. If it's 2.25 or less, you're a small business. And that goes for anything that has something in this column here. All right. If you see something over here, though, where it says size standards and number of employees, like logging. If you're in logging, your size standard, your threshold is 500 employees. And that changes industry to industry. You can see natural gas is 1,250 employees. Here, it's all over the place. Let's see, manufacturing, you said. There's a bunch of different types of manufacturing, so you want to be specific there. But if you, let's do janitorial services. I get that one a lot. So if you're in janitorial services, you can have 1,000 employees working for you. You can have 5,000 employees working for you. As long as you have not made more in gross receipts, gross annual revenue. If you have not made more than $22 million, a running average for the past 5 years, you are still a small business. All right, so that is the definition in federal government for a small business. Okay. All right, guys, we're coming up to the hour. So let me put my information up there. My contact information is there. It's on the top screen too. If you can't find me, just shoot the email address or hop on this class. Again, this is part 1. So we're going to be doing part 2 and 3 later in the month. Part 3 we usually do as a hybrid. So if you're in the Tampa area and you want to come by the Dale Mabry campus, I'm glad to see you guys there. If not, we'll have the Zoom open and we'll do this kind of session also. So let me open up the last couple of minutes for any questions you guys may have.
I had a question about the veteran-owned business certification. When you're going through the process of registering and going on SAM, I looked up somewhere and it said that like it could take several months to get your veteran-owned business certification. But I saw something about self-certifying, but I couldn't find any like hard information. Like, can I go through the process, go through SAM, get the cage code without having my certification yet?
Yeah, great question. And this applies, what I'm about to say applies to all of them, right? So all the certifications, because if you've done this before, the veteran-owned certifications were done by the Veterans Affairs, but as of this year, they've actually collapsed, they've consolidated everything under the Small Business Administration. So everything's under SBA now. So first answer, do this cage registration that we just talked about, do that first. All right, get your business established, get your state registration, get your tax ID number, get all that stuff, then get your cage code, and then go in for the small business certification. It will take a minute. The cage registration will take 10 to 15 business days once you get it submitted. The small business certifications, to actually get the certification, that can take weeks or months, because you've got to provide a lot more detail, your personal background, your personal resume, your company's capabilities. Usually they ask for the past 2 years of tax filings, your balance sheets, your profit and loss statements. These are highly coveted certifications that are very, very, I mean, $4.5 million is nothing to sneeze at. And that's per contract action. So the government is vetting, they're going through this application very, very clearly, right? So that's going to take more time. Now, to your other question about self-certifying, you today can say, you know what, Andy, I was in the military, I've got a DD-214, I'm a small business that is veteran owned, right? I'm a veteran, I own more than 51% of my company. I'm a self-certified veteran-owned company. That's all you have to do to be self-certified in that category, okay? The challenge with that is that doesn't give you any special treatment with the contracting officers. The contracting officers have to have that certification. You have to be vetted and you have to actually get that certification to have that credit, to have that contracting officer get the credit and be able to use those special contracting rules. So you can go out today and say you are a self-certified veteran-owned small business, but you need to go through the actual certification process if you want to have that credential. Great question.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey.
So what about the no bids and pretty much like the purchasing, micro purchasing and simplified acquisitions?
Great question too. So what we'll talk about in part 2 are some of those thresholds. And like you just mentioned, there are end users, right? So hard hat here, that don't have to go through a contracting officer. They have what's called an impact card or a government credit card, and they can buy up to $5,000 or $10,000. I think $10,000 is a pretty typical limit. So they can actually do micro purchasing, small purchasing at that threshold. There's another threshold at $350,000 called the simplified acquisition threshold, SAT. So the simplified acquisition threshold says that every contract that is under that $350,000 has to go to a small business. Contracting officers actually get in trouble. They have to go through a lot of steps to award a contract at that level to something other than a small business. So great question. That simplified acquisition threshold of $350,000, if you are doing business under that category, the contract officers for sure are going to want to know about you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, guys, we're coming up on the hour. I'll hang out if there's any other questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys in part 2.
When will be part 2? When is part 2?
Turn it over to Patricia. Patricia, are you still on? Let me see here if I've got it.
From your account?
Patricia, are you on?
Also, I got one more question, sir.
Go for it.
With a capability statement, is it good to make a capability statement website page?
Yeah, absolutely. So your capability statement, you probably want to make that like a one pager. You want your business name, your contact information, your NAICS codes. So we'll talk about it again in part 2, but your 5 or 10 NAICS codes that you focus on, like I say, your contact information, any past performance, and you want to put that in like a PDF document and think of that as like your company resume, and try to keep that down to one page. Post that on your website, send it out to contracting officers, make sure that they see the capability statements there.
Thank you for your time today. We hope this workshop was instructive and informative. Please find additional accredited courses and other support services on our website at nc-rgc.com